You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
You can now access the latest in medical news on your Amazon Alexa-enabled device. Join me, Perry Wilson, every weekday morning for Medscape Medical Minute, where I highlight the top medical stories of the day. To add Medscape Medical Minute to your flash briefing, search for Medscape Medical Minute on Amazon and click Enable. Or open the Amazon Alexa app, go to Skills, search for Medscape Medical Minute, and click Enable. Then say, Alexa, what's the news? Or, Alexa, what's my flash briefing? I hope you'll join us.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for July 30th, 2021. This week, only a brief mention about COVID, 2 studies on alcohol, and a very important study on stable coronary artery disease. First up, COVID. I just can't go there, friends. I'm so tired and frustrated and utterly confused about the new mask mandates and the move to do more testing. I mean, do people not remember the basic 2x2 tables and the problems with testing for low prevalence conditions? Hint, false positives. I've been saying the same thing on this podcast every week. You all know the story. It's now a pandemic only for the unvaccinated, especially those with risk factors. I don't envy the policymakers, and I'm simply moving on to cardiology topics. There were 2 contrasting papers on alcohol published this week. At the HRS meeting in Boston, which is part virtual and part in person, the famous group from Adelaide, Australia, presented and published an interesting study on alcohol intake and the risk of AFib. Jackie P. published a study. The group, with first author Dr. Samuel Tu, senior author Chris Wong, used data from the UK Biobank, which is a prospective cohort study of nearly 500,000 middle-aged people from the UK. Now, these are folks who were recruited and volunteered to have their health data followed over the years. The research team from Australia studied the question of total and beverage-specific alcohol consumption on new AF. Now, you might wonder why we need another alcohol and AF study. We already have many of Bradford Hill's criteria of causation are already present. For instance, listeners of this podcast know that there is biologic plausibility for alcohol causing AFib. There are plenty of prior observational studies confirming a dose-dependent association between alcohol and AFib, and a very recent and elegant RCT showing that alcohol abstinence in patients with AFib reduce AFib episodes. Now, this new study, however, addressed an important question that comes up all the time during the AFib clinic discussions of alcohol. Namely, patients will ask, come on doc, can I have a little bit, say 1 drink a day or every other day? And herein lies the most interesting aspect of this paper. Compared to the oodles of prior observational studies on alcohol and AFib, the results had some similar findings and some novel ones. The similar findings, of course, included the observation that heavy drinking, beyond moderate drinking, of any beverage, was clearly associated with a greater risk of AFib. The 2 novel findings were A, at low consumption levels less than 7 UK drinks per week, there was a lower risk of AFib, lower risk. Then at levels of intake more than that, risk of AFib goes up in a linear dependent way, as seen in the previous studies. Now, researchers call this a J-shaped relationship, and it's a novel finding because all previous observational studies have shown that any intake of alcohol increases the odds of AFib. And this includes a large recently published study from European authors who used a similar design, which I will link to. This was a study of about 100,000 middle-aged people in Northern Europe, and they found this classic linear dose-dependent increase in AFib beginning with any intake of alcohol. The second novel finding from the Australian team was that a beverage-specific analysis found that intake of beer, cider, increased AFib risk, while red wine and spirits did not. And when you look at the curves for the specific beverages, AFib risk goes up with any intake of beer, but with wine and spirits, the AFib risk doesn't increase until you get past 7 drinks per week. Okay, comments. These are observational findings. It is the only way to study this question. You can't use a randomized trial because in a randomized trial, we would randomly assign one group modest alcohol intake, the other group higher doses, and we would completely control the dose of alcohol, diet, exercise, travel. You would have to imprison or impound humans for years to control everything, and obviously this is not feasible. As nicely laid out in the accompanying editorial from Dr. Thomas Dooland and Greg Marcus from the UCSF, the key limitation in all observational studies like this is that participants choose to drink alcohol, and inherent in that choice are potfuls of other variables, only some of which can be adjusted for with statistics. Then there's the matter of recall bias. People self-report their alcohol, and any doctor knows that's not accurate. Now, the UK Biobank also includes mostly white people who volunteer to be studied, which may produce a healthy volunteer bias, and of course that issue affects the generalizability of the data. A couple of other notable facts. This is really important. A UK drink is 8 grams, is substantially smaller than a standard US drink at 14 grams. So the threshold here for American listeners is actually 4 US drinks per week, which is a pretty small dose. Another factor, which was clearly and laudably set out by the authors, thank you authors, was that they did not adjust for multiple testing. This means that the secondary findings on beverage specificity have more susceptibility to false positive findings. They write that the associations, quote, must be considered exploratory. My friends, whenever you read, quote, these findings must be considered exploratory, take that seriously and recognize that this is a code for these findings may be due to the play of chance. The strongest factor that suggests confounding on the matter of beer being worse than wine is that beer drinkers had more comorbidities. Okay, now how do we reconcile the findings from this Australian study with the previous observations showing no risk-free amount of alcohol? And the answer is, I don't know exactly, but I suspect it is a matter of residual confounding or perhaps just a play of chance. But it doesn't matter. If we simply put our common sense hat on, there are obvious messages here. First, any level of alcohol more than very small, moderate levels of alcohol intake is clearly a modifiable risk for AFib. High levels of alcohol intake are surely a risk. And few doctors would posit that 4 drinks per week is problematic. But if a specific patient had alcohol as a trigger, it makes perfect sense to reduce it or stop it. And finally, in patients who have AFib, we know that reducing or eliminating alcohol intake stands a good chance of helping, and that seems like an important thing for patients to know. This paper also got me thinking about a broader point. And it came from a question that a patient asked me. He asked me, why is there so much more AFib around? This patient had many friends with AFib. And indeed, the AFib epidemic does seem related to wealth. As nations become richer, its citizens eat more food, drink more alcohol, and feel more stress. And so the downstream effects of these are a perfect storm for atrial fibrillation. And I think that when the current crisis in communicable disease abates, we will be back to the paradox that despite our wealth and our medical advances and all this digital health, people aren't living any longer. The second alcohol paper, the journal BMC Medicine, has published a new analysis, and it's augmented with a meta-analysis of papers that assessed alcohol intake in relation to all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality in patients with known heart disease. Now, this new analysis included 14,000 patients from the UK Biobank study who had had previous MI, angina, or stroke. So these are patients with established disease. The authors then augmented their findings with a meta-analysis of 12 previously published studies on a similar matter. They then compared outcomes of drinkers against non-drinkers, and they found a J-shaped relationship with risk reduction, yes, risk reduction, with low to moderate level of drinking. And get this, they found no statistically significant elevated risks at higher levels of drinking. This led to the conclusion, and sit down for this, people with established heart disease might not need to quit drinking to prevent a repeat cardiovascular event. I'm serious, this was published in a real journal. Now the first author, Shengyi Ding, and I apologize if I mispronounced it, cautioned that the findings might, quote, overestimate the reduced risk for recurrent events for moderate drinkers due to the underrepresentation of heavy drinkers and the categorization of former drinkers who may have quit drinking due to ill health as non-drinkers in some of the data sets. A journalist, Megan Brooks, writing on the heart.org Medscape Cardiology, did something that all readers of health coverage should look for and all journalists covering observational studies should do. She got a researcher to speak candidly about flawed methods. She talked with a man named Dr. Richard Sates. Sates is a professor at Boston University School of Medicine and Public Health, and he noted that in the few studies that excluded people who quit drinking because of illness, the effects of drinking were attenuated. He said, quote, "It is honestly tiresome that investigators continue to do these studies and journals continue to publish them even though they continue to have the same flaws. The bottom line," he said, based on work by others who used appropriate methods, is that alcohol in low amounts is unlikely to provide cardiovascular mortality benefits. Indeed, the authors noted this in the finding but buried it in the supplement. My friends, always look at the supplement. I took this copy and paste from their paper. Quote, "When studies with former drinkers in the reference group were excluded, the association was considerably weakened." Of course it was. Dear Ms. Brooks and Dr. Sates, 2 words, thank you. My friends, this is the problem with observational studies you don't see much of in RCTs. In RCTs, randomization mostly balances these issues so you can narrow down the effect of the exposure, the drug, the procedure, etc. A final pro tip, observational studies that report paradoxes, like drinking is good for people with heart disease, or obesity is protective in AFib or heart failure, are almost always due to bias, be it selection bias or collateral bias, in other words, due to other factors. Final topic today is the stability of coronary artery disease. The journal Circulation has published a super important observational study of patients with stable CAD. This is a big one because it so perfectly confirms the findings of the randomized controlled trials, which have changed so few minds. The study is called Clarify Study, and its first author, Jules Mesnier, senior author, Professor Philip Gabriel Stagg. Now, before I tell you about the study, remember the saying, science tells us what we can do, trials tell us what we should do, and registries tell us what we are doing or what's happening. So Clarify is a registry study whose main findings are descriptive, and I like that because the authors don't try to make causal conclusions about one group versus another. They simply describe what's happening. Clarify is a prospective registry of about 32,000 patients who have stable CAD, and yes, you really had to have strong evidence of coronary disease to get in it. It was enrolled in 45 countries, not the U.S. I'm not sure they could have done this in the U.S. The study goal was to describe the prevalence and time course of angina, as well as the effect of changes in angina status on outcomes. Now, the follow-up was about 5 years. And Table 1, which typically lists the baseline characteristics, shows that baseline medical therapy in Clarify was excellent. More than 90% of these patients were on antiplatelets and lipid-lowering drugs, and more than 70% on beta blocker and ACE or ARB. It had about 7,000 or 22% of patients in the Clarify registry who reported angina at baseline, chest pain, angina. Now, you'll never guess what happened to these patients with angina. Did they die off? Did they require PCI? Or maybe they needed cabbage? No, double no. At 1 year, in 40% or 4 out of 10 patients, the angina disappeared without revascularization. And at 5 years, 84% of patients with angina had regression of it without a new intervention. And only 4.5% of patients with angina had to be controlled with coronary revascularizations. And patients whose angina had resolved at 1 year with conservative management were not at higher risk of CV death or myocardial infarction than those who never experienced angina. Now, of course, not surprising was the observation that patients who developed new angina or had persistence of angina had a higher risk of CV events when compared with patients without angina. Journalist Patrice Wendling has excellent coverage of this. There's some great quotes. Senior author Professor Stagg said, "It's reasonable to have a trial of watchful waiting with medical treatment in patients who have angina and stable CAD because the risk of events is low, and the chance that this will regress is very high, and if it regresses, they have excellent outcomes." Wendling writes that Stagg, himself an interventionalist, said there are financial incentives for revascularizations in countries with some element of fee-for-service. But beyond that, there's also a true belief among interventionalists. It's, quote, "It's hard to believe that what we're doing is not useful, so you tend to want to have the vessel open, and you tend to believe it is actually helping patients." Also quoted in Wendling's piece is Christopher Granger from Duke. This study adds to the evidence that medical management is very reasonable and may be the optimal treatment for most of these patients, and is partly related to the somewhat surprising finding in this study that many of these patients had resolution of angina with just medical therapy. And this, quote, "Revascularization is still important for a portion of our patients, but it's way less important than we used to think it was." My friends, I don't know what it will take to change the clogged mindset of modern cardiology. I mean, maybe it will take a generation or two or maybe three. But the trials show it, right? Berry 2, Courage, Ischemia, they all find that revascularization, PCI, added to medicines doesn't reduce heart attacks and MIs. And that is because stable CAD is so darn stable. And now, in this carefully done registry, we learn that nearly 90% of patients with angina due to coronary disease experience regression of their symptom. The angina got better with medicines alone. Now, not only is this important for doctors and patients to know, it is also important for scientists studying interventions. What do I mean exactly? Well, this podcast has covered over and over and over again the importance of placebo controls. Now, after Courage and Ischemia trials came out, some of the proponents of PCI say, "Mandrola, you're heartless. PCI might not have reduced MIs or death, but angina was improved." Yes, it did, and I don't doubt it got better because patients in those trials knew their treatment assignment. If you got a stent or a bypass, you clearly knew it. If you did not get those things, you clearly knew that too. So, did the angina get so much better after revascularization because it improved blood flow? Or did it get better because of the placebo effect of feeling fixed and cared for? Now, this observational study showing frequent resolution of angina without intervention strongly argues for the placebo effect. And of course, it bolsters the results of one of the best studies ever done in cardiology, the Orbita trial, which clearly suggests that there's a placebo effect from PCI. In summary, coronary artery disease is a focal manifestation of atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is a systemic disease throughout our body. Medical therapy, like statins, aspirin, and lifestyle interventions work because they address the systemic disease. Yes, of course, in some cases, these focal stenoses persist and patients benefit from revascularization. But Clarify confirms that is the exception, not the rule. My friends, angina got better mostly without intervention. Sleep on that. And as far as HRS is currently ongoing, Heart Rhythm Society meeting in Boston. I'll feature some of the highlights next week, and there are some things to say. I guess a teaser would be that my field gets very, very excited about new stuff to do procedures with. So that's it for this week in cardiology. As always, I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. And remember, friends, if you like this podcast, please take the time to give us a rating. Write us a little review, even a sentence or two. It really helps others find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.